lie. For weeks now, a whole lot of people have been telling the same story. He has no plan, he has no strategy, no discipline, there's no off ramp. He has no idea what he's doing. Every threat was reckless, every deadline was fake, every escalation was proof that we were sliding towards just yet another forever war. That was the script. That was the narrative consensus. Those were the talking points. That was the smug, pre-packaged takeaway handed out to the public before the thing had even played out. And so, as we sit here this morning, what do we have? We have a ceasefire window. We have a stated public push towards talks. We have a moment, not a total resolution, not a finished piece, not some neat, bow tied around the whole proceeding, but there's movement. And that should matter to anybody who's been paying attention if they're being genuine, because for all the noise, for all the chest thumping analysis, for all the people who spent the last month acting like they had X-ray vision into the future, we are no longer talking about uncontrolled escalation as the only path left on the table. We are talking about pressure that appears to have produced an opening. And let's be honest about what that means. It means the people who spent weeks saying there was no strategy now find themselves in a bit of a problem because the facts this morning are very inconvenient for that narrative. Now, before anyone gets carried away, I'd like to be very clear. No, that does not mean that everything is settled. This does not mean that every detail has been resolved and ironed out. It does not mean that the Iranian side is fully coherent, fully unified, or even fully capable of enforcing every part of what may or may not have been discussed that led us here. And no, it does not mean that trust suddenly exists where trust should not belong. So we don't need to be ridiculous and let's have clear eyes going into this. But a ceasefire window, a path to talks, and visible movement under pressure is not no plan. That is what pressure is supposed to do. It's what leverage is for. And that's the part of this reaction that is driving me absolutely crazy because so many people now talk as though they have never seen a negotiation in their entire lives. They act as though the concept of leverage has become just too complex for modern political commentary. Like, this is really not that hard to understand. You start with a maximal position, you create pressure, you use pressure, you force urgency, you move the field. And then, if the pressure works, you try to convert that pressure into terms. This isn't failure. This isn't some drift from the initial goal. It's certainly not chickening out. It's negotiation. That is how negotiations work in business and life. It's how they work in labor fights, trade fights, real estate, politics, and yes, international diplomacy. You do not have to open with the smallest thing you hope to get. You open in a way that creates room to move backwards towards the outcome that you find agreeable. That's the entire point. The opening position is almost never the final position. Like the threat is not the treaty. The first demand is not the final settlement. Everybody knows this. Or at least, I guess everybody used to know it. And if I ask for 10, knowing I may settle at 7 without any pressure, I would. And if I put no pressure, I would have gotten 4. Then 7 is not surrender. 7's a win. It's not backing down. It's not collapse. Like that is what it looks like when leverage changes the landscape. And if people need historical example of how this works under extreme pressure and how negotiation tactics at this level work, we can go back and look at the Cuban Missile Crisis because One thing people forget about in that like very serious episode is that it didn't unfold in some clean, linear, or elegant way. It was messy. It was tense. A lot of the conversations were contradictory. Messages were coming out of Moscow in different tones with different demands, oftentimes from different people. You know, one communication looked kind of workable, another would come in harsher, and they would send them in. Like, so JFK and Robert F. Kennedy, as was later described, one of the key judgments from the American side, from Bobby Kennedy, was to answer the more workable message, not let the entire negotiation be trapped by the latest. So what happened was, uh, right up until 0 hour, and the ships were in the way, they were back and forth with so many different demands. And the second to last one that Nikita Khrushchev sent was relatively workable. Wasn't ideal, but it was workable. And right before the ships, everything was really coming to a head. They sent a final list of demands that was completely unreasonable, that we would have never agreed to. So, at the suggestion of Bobby Kennedy, he told JFK, ignore that last thing that came in. Say you accept the terms of the second one and pretend like you didn't get the other one. Moscow was like, shoot, I mean, I guess it's over now. They agreed to that. We did send that. Uh, Everybody kind of blinked, and then they got to the table and settled the whole thing down once temperatures cooled and everything went. And like, to keep it plain, like, ignore the last burst of maximalism and take hold of the opening that lets both sides take a step back from that cliff and use that as the path out. And in this situation, what makes that possible? It's fear, it's urgency, it's pressure, and the mutual recognition that the next step could be catastrophic. Now, obviously, no historical analogy is perfect. I'm not telling you every conflict is the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm not telling you every leader's, JFK, or every attorney general's Bobby Kennedy. I'm not telling you that, every adversary behaves the exact same way that the Soviets did in 1962. But I'm saying that the basic logic here is not something exotic or new. When negotiations are live, especially under serious pressure, the purpose of terms is often not to settle everything forever. It's to create a framework to stop the firing so that you can talk without bullet noises interrupting the discussion. And that matters, and that's important, because one of the dumbest things I'm seeing right now is people acting as though any opening framework, any first step of terms, any provisional basis for a ceasefire is automatically the final, permanent, morally binding end state of this entire conflict. No, of course not. It's not how this works. This is not how any of that works. A ceasefire framework is not a final peace treaty. It should go without saying, but apparently it's been lost. An opening position is not the last word. A basis for talks is not the same thing as endorsing every single term floating around in the fog of a fast-moving negotiation with, the influx of the internet and Iranian state-run media. Sometimes the point is not to sanctify this on paper. Sometimes the point is to stop shooting so you can get back to the table. Sometimes the immediate value of the term is not that they're perfect. It's just that they create a pause. They create space. They create a channel. They create a way to test whether pressure can be turned into something more durable and more prosperous for all involved. And that's why all of this lazy commentary about, oh, well, Iran floated this, or Iran said that, or these are Iran's terms, are so unserious. Of course they floated terms. Of course the Iran state media put out their version and took a victory lap. Of course, they're posturing for their own audience and their own people. That's what parties do in the middle of a negotiation. I find it baffling that people don't understand this. So the question is not whether or not the opening paper is beautiful. The question is whether the opening paper gets both sides to stop firing long enough to find out what's actually possible. That's the value of framework. That's the value of a pause. That's the value of the ceasefire window that's been created. And yet somehow people always pretend every opening move must be judged as though it were the final, you know, just inscription on the marble facade of history that is unchangeable and immovable and uneditable, which is absurd. And more than that, it's the selective absurdity because we've seen this pattern with Trump for years. He says and requests something maximalist. Everybody loses their mind. The pressure builds, then the terms shift, and the final result ends up landing somewhere a little short of the gigantic ask, but much closer to his preferred outcome than where things started. It's not random, it's not accidental, it's a method. He wrote a book about it. And I am baffled that at some point, I mean, this isn't some book that he wrote during his presidency. This is decades and decades old. Just read it. You get the inside cliff notes as to how this goes. You don't have to enjoy the theatrics. You don't have to admire his tone, but at some point you got to notice the pattern. And that's exactly why the people who swore there was no plan are having such a hard time this morning. Because what they're doing is just a disingenuous thing. They're looking at what they're looking at now is not the disaster that they had promised. Even so, they're forced to try to frame it that way. It's not the blind lurch into some endless war that they've been advertising for the entirety of the conflict. It's something much more inconvenient than that for their narrative. It's movement. It's leverage producing an opening. It's pressure creating a pause before the worst options had to be tested. And that's where this starts getting really revealing because, you know, I guess I want to talk through how fast the people, who told you this was reckless, this was monstrous, this was dangerously real, have suddenly pivoted to pretending, it was never real at all. And that's, where this whole thing gets so revealing. Because the same people who spent days screaming that the pressure was reckless, dangerous, unhinged, beyond the pale, are now pivoting, genuinely in real time, to a totally different argument. Now it's, well, he never meant it. He was bluffing. He chickened out. It was all theater. He's such an unserious man who doesn't even know what he wants. This just happened. And you cannot make sense of that level of inconsistency. Either the threat mattered or it didn't. Either the pressure was meaningful or it wasn't. Either the situation was dangerous enough to justify all the hand-wringing and hysteria, or the hysteria was performative and the whole thing was posturing. Because it can't be both every single time, just depending on what is politically useful. That's not analysis. That is a partisan reflex. That is, conclusion first, reasoning later. That is the pre-written script swapping out adjectives as events change. If he follows through, he's reckless. If he pauses, he's weak. If he threatens, he's unstable. If the threat works, it never mattered anyway. If they fail, he was impulsive. If talks open up and a ceasefire happens, he chickened out. That's not serious analytical thinking. That is political improv by people who wrote the ending before Act One was even over. And the other layer of dishonesty here that really needs to be laid out and taken to task is that some people are now, taking Iran's opening posture, Iran's version of events, Iran's public facing proposal, and their own obvious face saving narrative, and treating it like it's the final American position on this matter, as though anything floated by the other side automatically becomes the notarized final deal. Like it's baffling to me that people don't understand how this actually works because, a counterproposal, a counterproposal is not a treaty. An opening list of demands is not a signed agreement. A framework to stop the firing is not a permanent truce. And the basis for the talks is not the same thing as endorsing every single line item one side throws on the table to begin the conversation. Everybody with a functioning brain should understand that. The other side puts forward what it wants. That's what these opening conversations are for. You put out what you want, it gets tested. The other side puts pressure on it. You know, what's beyond the pale or too absurd gets rejected. You strip down the non-negotiables or what's you deem to be impossible. You see what survives, direct contact with the reality of the situation, and that's negotiation. I mean, that's why I feel like the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of parallels this in that regard, because the lesson was not every message from the other side is sacred. The lesson was not the last and most inflated demands define the entire negotiation. The lesson was that when the stakes are high and the signals are mixed, serious people look for the formulation that creates a pathway away from the brink. They look for the framework that allows for a de-escalation and the ability to implement terms that are practical and durable. They do not confuse the opening of conversations with a settlement of that talk. And that's the point, and it should be self-evident, but apparently it's not. So when people grab the most flattering version of Iran's own self-presentation of the terms and instantly recycle it as proof that America has already surrendered, what you're really watching is not some sober analysis. You're watching some wish casting into the ether. You're watching people desperately hoping that the story turns out to be a humiliation because they need it to be. Not because they know that it's true, not because the evidence compels them to feel that way, not because they are so emotionally invested in the failure of the Iranian state, but because they are so emotionally invested in the failure of a man at the center of all of it, that even a ceasefire has to be somehow translated into a defeat before any of the dust has even had a chance to settle. And that should tell you a lot. It tells you that this is no longer just a disagreement over policy. For a lot of people, it is. But sadly, for more, it's some psychological thing. They don't merely dislike the president, it's become pretty vital to them and their identity that he fail, never thinking about the second, third, fourth, fifth order effects that if the president fails, the state has a failure, the country does, and then there's trickle downs. But if you want a singular person to fail, that is very different than just a personal dislike. Because when somebody needs a result to be bad, you can rebrand it until it sounds bad enough. A ceasefire can become a weakness if you want it to. A pause can become a surrender or a capitulation with the right, you know, headline to it. A negotiation could become chickening out, not following through on your threats. And an opening to conversations can become a collapse of the military goals that we set out to achieve. You know, a gain becomes something that they can try to explain away before ink is even dry on whatever thing we're working on. And that's exactly what you're watching play out in real time right now. And to be fair, if I was uneasy, deeply uneasy about the infrastructure threat, I covered that yesterday. And that's why when we talked yesterday, I was like, today's gonna be a big day. Regardless of what happens, either he backs out and doesn't, bomb them to the Stone Age or completely eviscerate their society, as the many mean tweets stated. Either he does it, and then The ripple effects of that are massive. He doesn't do it, but he backs away, or they get some framework for a deal, and that's where we are. But the I was so uneasy about the infrastructure threat, because I do understand why it could be useful as leverage. I understand why creating fear and uncertainty and urgency can pressure this already fractured regime. Like, I understand the cold logic of forcing the other side to choose between terms in front of them and consequences behind them. I get it. But I also think that there is a real line there that we were flirting with that was real dangerous, because once you start talking about stripping nations of bridges and power plants, you're no longer dancing in the margins. You are talking about crossing into something pretty dark, something that is really difficult to morally justify, something that is even harder to politically contain, something that, you know, something real borderline impossible to come back from once, you know, the heat from the bombs dissipates and somebody has to rebuild whatever's left. So, the ease that people have in throwing shade at it after the fact is hypocritical. But yeah, I did have a very serious unease about it, and that was real. The concern was real. And that is precisely why the ceasefire window does matter, because pressure produced the movement that we're seeing. You know, before you cross the worst line that's on the table, and that is the point of sometimes escalating and pushing things to the brink, is the whole point. You do not threaten that at that level because your dream is to carry it out in full. You threaten at that level because you are trying to create enough fear, enough urgency, and enough leverage that the other side decides the deal in front of them is better than the cliff behind them, even if they want to convince themselves that the threat is empty. Is that a chance they're willing to take? But that is the strategy. Is it an ugly strategy sometimes? Sure. Is it a high risk strategy? It often is, but it is a strategy. And I think this is where so many of his critics still fail to understand him, which does seem strange to me given, how long he's been in the public eye, even pre-politics, and certainly for the past 10 years, the most looked into, dissected, psychoanalyzed, medically analyzed, punditry, pummeled man in history. Yet somehow there is such a lack of understanding by his critics as to how he actually functions, when there has been absolutely zero effort to conceal how he functions and how he negotiates. Like I said before, he wrote a book that lays it down. If you have any confusions, you got Cliff Notes. Give it a peruse. You can kind of have a spoiler alert before any of this stuff goes on. And yet, for the entire time he's been in power and used tactics that he wrote about 35, 40 years ago, like, people still run the same, projection thought process as to what he's doing. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have this, or he's backing down. When, yes, he anchors at a high thing, accepts something a little bit less than that initial ridiculous offer, makes threats, puts the pressure on. Does like it happens every time, and yet people are still shocked each time it happens. And as it continues to happen, like there's people are so wrong about it so regularly that it defies logic to be taken serious. I know that if you want to manifest destiny of your, you know, political rival, but it's a bad way to live life, because if you judge your happiness off the successes or failures of others, you're never going to be happy. But people just still refuse to understand him. They keep trying to read him through the playbook that he doesn't use. He's not a conventional politician. He's not a conventional diplomat. And he sure as hell is not some conventional messenger. Sometimes his language is wild. Sometimes the tactics look excessive and maybe even erratic. Sometimes the whole thing feels like one social media post away from giving, half of the Washington and global establishment a nervous breakdown or a heart attack. Fair enough. But there's also something, undeniably true about it. Is that he keeps getting mocked before the outcome. And then people have to scramble to explain the outcome once it arrives. It's comical the amount of times that that's happened. Enough that pretending it was always random starts to sound less like genuine, well thought out skepticism and falls into the category of flat out self denial. No, it doesn't mean every move he's ever made is wise or 4D chess, as his giant, advocates would say. Doesn't mean that every threat made is smart or wise. It doesn't mean that every instinct he has belongs in a military or geopolitical textbook. But it does mean that this lazy line, he has no plan, just looks dumber and dumber each time it gets recycled. Because sometimes a plan does not look polished. Sometimes it looks chaotic. It looks loud. A lot of times that's on purpose. Sometimes it looks like being willing to absorb ridicule, absorb panic, absorb elite contempt, and keep pushing until the pressure starts to move something. And there is a, political lesson in that too. A lot can be accomplished by somebody willing to look impolite in rooms full of people who worship polish. A lot can be completed by somebody willing to be called bombastic, reckless, embarrassing, vulgar, and, just impossible, and still keep applying pressure until the board changes. That doesn't mean style doesn't matter. It does. That doesn't mean restraint is not important. It doesn't mean that criticism is always wrong. But criticism has to at least be tethered to reality. And the reality this morning is not what critics told you to expect. And now they have to scramble to justify where we currently are in the shadow of their doom and gloom punditry or political statements. We were told there was no plan. We were told there was no off ramp. We were told this was blind escalation. And yet here we are, the morning of the 8th, looking at a pause, looking at an open table where negotiations can happen in this window and movement before the most dangerous lever at our disposal was fully tested or pulled. And for people saying it's nothing or that it's trivial or that it's not some rounding error, this matters. With that said, it's important to be clear about where it stands because, do I trust the Iranian regime? No, of course not. I know more now than before any of this happened. They have a very, very, very long track record of delaying, waiting out rather, American political cycles of 4 to 8 years, kicking the can until a new guy comes in, tries to try it again, washing, rinse and repeat, and delay, 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 lie, then never admit to lying, pretend like you never did any of the stuff that you did. That playbook is pretty tried and true. It's run for a bit. So no, I do not trust them. And do I think this could still fall apart? Absolutely, I do. I think that the fractured leadership sending mixed signals. There's competing factions in Iran now to fill that vacuum and that void. It could blow up tomorrow without question. It's absolutely fragile. It's uncertain. This piece or this pause or this window isn't carved in stone, but fragile openings still matter. Like it matters a lot more than welded shut iron doors. If you have a little opening, it's something. And, in fact, in situations like this, fragile openings matter enormously because, yesterday the conversation was about something way worse, the annihilation of the civilian infrastructure and the ability for Iran to function as a country was on the table. Now we're trying to plan a timeline for us to sit down at a table together. Those are very different things, you know. So when people who said that the outcome was impossible are now racing to explain why it either doesn't count or it doesn't matter or is secretly somehow proof of his weakness that they were telling you about before, you should notice that too and pick up on that pattern because there is a difference between a real criticism and a compulsion. There is a difference between analysis and a need. And too much of what you're hearing right now sounds like people who cannot emotionally afford for this to look like it worked. That is why the reaction feels so forced. That's why it feels so preloaded. That's why every development has to be instantly translated into some version of the same conclusion. He lost. He failed. He backed down. He panicked. Taco, he chickened out. No matter what happens, the answer was already written somewhere. And when the answer is written before the evidence arrives, it's not journalism, it's not analysis. That, my friends, is branding. So no, I'm not telling you this is over. I'm not telling you you get a permanent deal. I'm not saying that any of that is guaranteed. I'm not telling everybody, we should spike the football, take the victory lap, and declare history settled on the matter. What I'm saying is something a lot simpler. People who said there was no plan have been forced once again to confront a result they did not think would be produced. And whether they admit it or not, it matters because there is a political skill, a very unusual one, in being laughed at right up until the moment everybody else has to explain why the thing they said could never happen just happened. And whatever else you want to say about him, he does have that skill. He's had it for a long time. So, you know, this morning the scoreboard, isn't subtle. They mocked him, doubted him, said there was no plan. And whether people like his style or not, whether they like the man or not, whether they want to admit it or not, there is motion in a direction that's advantageous for everybody, regardless of what it looks like moving forward. That remains to be seen. But in moments like this, where it was going on and the fears of forever wars, now we're talking formally with Pakistan acting as these proxies, and there's movement. There's still so many questions about how it goes, but movement and motion is there. The window for the ceasefire is there. The pathway to talks exists. And there's one more result sitting on the board where experts swore there would be none. That's the story, because that's the reality. That's why the he has no plan people sound a lot less like they have insight this morning and a lot more like another bad script just got overtaken by the reality of events that happened in front of him. It's you know I've often thought, people call him thin-skinned all the time. They say that he can't take criticism, and there is a truth to that, in that he does lash out at people who are critical of him, and you know he would say hold them to account. Others would say, you know petulantly, talks about journalists who frame things in a way that is slightly disingenuous or leave out things that would be helpful or whatever it may be. He's had a long history of doing that, but also he has had a very long history of weathering people, because we talk about the small instances where he does, come back, Rosie O'Donnell, or these other, you know, throwaway, he would say locker room talk statements, or just These statements that have happened over his entire life in the public eye. Yeah, we don't talk about the things that he lets go or the things he gets over or the things he doesn't address because he's willing to look a little ridiculous or do something a different way. He also does have his inability to claim defeat. So he's no different than a lot of the people I'm complaining about on the left who are reframing it as, a loss in order to, benefit their political necessities. But and he does the same thing. He can never, it's part of his rules from Roy Cohn, never admit defeat. So, I mean, it's not, they should have some similarities in those two sides. But, he's willing to look ridiculous in the short term or do something different. And that remains, whether you like it or not, that's a fair conversation to have. But if you have it honestly, then it's a fair conversation. If you project on it, then it's not a fair conversation. It is just projection and some weird, morbid hope for a downfall or a weird, morbid hope that your worst fears about someone who you don't like will come true. You want to manifest the worst version of it in order to be right, then you want something good to happen for everybody. And once you cross that bridge in your own mind that you would prefer to be right over something good happening, then your entire internal motivation structure is corrupted in a way that makes your logic flawed. So, that's where we kind of end up here. And there's still so much more to come from all this. There's still so much, to be seen. Ideally, Friday, they're going to be sitting down. Who's left to negotiate on the Iranian side remains to be seen. Will they meet in person? Will they be, Islamabad has, opened up their, city in order to host these negotiation talks. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about what's going to happen, a lot to unfold, and all of it needs to be taken for what it is, not immediately project our version of how, acts 2 and 3 of the negotiation process are going to go. So take them for what they are, address them, give a pat on the back for progress where you see it, and then be critical of a backslide or a position or a concession that's made that you don't. But don't do it before any of the evidence has arrived. Like your headline cannot be already printed before they've sat down at a table. And that's what we see far too often. And if you write the headline before the story has even happened, you always write the story that happens to fit the headline you already wrote. It dictates what you leave out, what you emphasize, what words you choose to use, and how you choose to frame it. Because in your head, the headline was already written. So once the event happens, I have to make the headline. So I have to make this entire story I'm writing match that headline because I already wrote it. And that's where it gets dangerous because even if the people writing it or the people telling the story or the pundits on television don't even know it in themselves, if they have the headline, if they have the headline before any of the events happen, they will always discuss it, write about it in a way that fits whatever version of it they hope it to be. And that's where it gets dangerous because we are not watching the news in situations like that or reading articles about the current event. We are reading op-eds written ahead of time, disguised as breaking journalism. And that is not a healthy way to get information. But there's a lot more to come from all of this. And we will keep you posted as all of it comes along. I don't know where it goes. I don't know what comes from it. And, hopefully we can find a version of this that's beneficial. But, to go back to kind of a point that I had discussed with Mr. York on the previous show about this narrative of we lost or Iran won the negotiation. It harkens back to that the need or the want to be the compulsion to need to be right forces you to root for failure and then create it out of nothing. Because this idea that we lost or are losing is is something that's just baffling to me. Of course, there have been injuries to our servicemen and women. There have been deaths. Yes, there have been, planes and helicopters that, been shot down or had to be destroyed by our own military so they didn't fall into the hands of the Iranians. There's a cost of war. The bombs are expensive. There is, their bombs are cheaper and they don't, all of those things, yes, all of those happened. But to look at the scoreboard as we sit here on Wednesday the 8th and say that Iran won, I don't know what sort of creative mental arithmetic you have to do to land at that conclusion, but you got to be mentally limber to stick that landing because it is absurd to make that jump. The entire leadership of a country that has been combative towards the United States and the entire West for 47 years was decapitated with maybe the first bomb, first, second, third of this entire engagement. Tens of thousands of military targets hit, destroyed, the entire Navy at the bottom of the ocean. The, the Ayatollah, that obviously, like I said before, that was part of the first thing, but two Ayatollahs gone, new one never really seen. The Gulf partners who, up until that point, have really actively tried to stay neutral in order to not poke the bear because they just said they're crazy, but just please don't make them mad. Let them do their own thing. They're mad at you, not us. So we don't want them, pointing stuff at us. And that worked for a long time. It was kind of get along, get on to get along. But since this happened, all of those Gulf partners who were, kind of ridiculously just catching haymakers from Iran in the wake of these attacks when they didn't do anything, started cozying up to the United States. So that entire, you know, the entire relationships in the Gulf region have shifted, and the geopolitical map of the alliances in that area are all pretty in favor of the United States when this, how this ever, as it currently stands, if it ends in some version after these talks, we're better positioned in the Gulf from an alliance standpoint and an ideological standpoint than we were when this first began. We also have the Europeans and the Asian communities who are getting the vast majority of their oil from the Strait. They are starting to put forth their own, military resources in order to help secure the Strait moving forward. It was something the United States had done for years and years and years. Even though we don't actually get the oil from the Strait, we did it as a matter of geopolitical stability and principle, in our role as Team America World Police. But in reality, we were doing it, not using it, and everybody complained about what we did, how we did it. And so we kind of washed our hands like, y'all want it? Come in and make sure your own stuff is safe because it's ridiculous that we are doing it and then getting yelled at by you for not doing it in a way that you think is fine. Y'all do it. And they complained about it. They've given a lot of press conferences about how evil we are. But at the end of the day, they're trying to get boats and ships together and up their support. There's up their military spending in order to support these efforts. So it's every version of it from when this started, a crippled Iranian military, a crippled leadership, an inability to build a nuclear bomb, the stability of the Strait moving forward with other partners, both in the Gulf and in Europe and Asia, who have a vested interest willing to use their weight to protect their own interests. We're in a better position now if we walked away today than we were a day before, because the ability to, Iran to spend money on all of these proxies that they have for decades and decades to sow instability in the region, now they got to fix roads and bridges and some of these military facilities or bases or infrastructure. They don't have the money to just be throwing it now at the Houthis or Hezbollah or Boko Haram or insert name of proxy group they have been throwing cash at like it was Magic City Monday for the past 40 years. That's drying up. and you can see it by involvement now. I mean, last night it does believe that some of the Houthis did shoot one of like their over-the-shoulder rockets into Israel. They're kind of getting involved with that last little array before the ceasefire took, and that's another thing I think people read too much into because last night when they announced the ceasefire, they were still firing on Iran. But as we've discussed in many occasions, this whole fracture protocol of the IRGC makes it pretty difficult for there to be a centralized command and immediate ceasefire. Like we talked about this yesterday, and clearly, even if there was one, there are going to be some, pot shots near the end due to either a lack of communication or somebody wanting to get a pot shot in and then being like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't get the facts." I assume they use faxes. Um, but there's a lot to it, and there's a lot more going on. But like we said before, or I don't know, I'm throwing a we out there. It's just me here today, and that's kind of what I was saying when we started this: is that we are Clayton and Delk are out looking for Delk's dog. So I hope that I don't know if Jack has been spotted in since the time we started this, but hopefully they track him down. So normally in doing the show, I'd have Clayton to bounce things off of, or Drake, depending on where they're there, or the commercial to get my thoughts together. But in this case, we're kind of just going free flow with it, and I'm kind of glad because the a preface yesterday that Tuesday was going to be a big day without knowing exactly which version of events would unfold. And so I'm glad we had the time today to fully go through and unpack what happened and the reaction to it and what is potentially to come next. There was going to be, a much better segue onto this, but like I said, since we don't have commercials today, the show is going to be a little bit shorter, and we're going to backfill those as they come. But I have a story I wanted to get to that is not, it doesn't actually make all that much sense for me to include it. I'd like to open with that. But I think I heard about it for the first time yesterday. And so I dug into this story that I just had not, I'm shocked I hadn't heard about. And if somebody else was here and Clayton was here, I would have asked him if he'd heard this story, but I will just go for it, and y'all let me know whether or not you've heard this tale. I'm going to try to campfire this for y'all because I do find it very entertaining because, you know, because I want to take us back for a minute because, like I said, this isn't breaking news and this isn't something that happened this week, but every once in a while a story comes back around, not because it's new, but because people start to realize that it meant more than they thought the first time they heard it, and they didn't really dive in deep enough. And this was one of those, at least for me. So this came out of Tennessee, of Nashville, Tennessee, a few years ago. And when the story first broke, it mostly got treated like this strange local crime story, the kind of thing, you read once, you kind of shake your head at, and you move on. But the more you kind of sit with it, the less it feels like just a weird headline, and it starts to feel like a story about something a bit bigger. This turns out to be a story about systems, about proximity, about what happens when somebody gets so close to something broken that the line between studying it and becoming a part of it starts to blur and eventually disappears. And once you hear this full story, it's hard to file it away as cleanly as I think we in Tennessee initially did. So let's walk through what happened. Back in 2019, Nashville was building a brand new detention center downtown. Fresh concrete, steel everywhere, new locks, new cameras, a clean slate. The kind of place that's supposed to fix everything the old system got wrong just by starting over. And while that building was going up, while people are still sanding, dust is in the air, workers coming and going, it's hectic. Nobody was really looking too closely at one more person walking through that site. Someone was getting on the inside. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over again, more than 20 times over the period of several weeks. Now, when you hear that, your mind goes somewhere specific. You picture a criminal, a crew, somebody planning an escape, but that's not who this was. The person doing all this sneaking in and out was someone named Alex Friedman. And it was a name that I had not heard prior to this, but the guy sneaking in and out disguised as a construction worker was one of the best known prison reform activists in the country. Served as a watchdog and a critic of the system, someone who built his reputation on understanding prisons and calling out what was broken inside of them as he saw it. And on paper, he is supposed to be one of the good guys. But investigators say while the jail was still under construction, he kept getting in by posing as a construction worker, walking the site, moving through the building, studying it. Not once, not casually, but repeatedly and in great depth and detail. And that's where the details start stacking. He's not just entering the building, he's stealing keys, keys that open dozens of doors. He's covering security cameras with tape. He's returning to some of these areas, some of these same areas again and again and again. He's making diagrams. And that's the moment it stops sounding like a stunt because a stunt wants attention. This very much did not. This was intended to be quiet and unnoticed, but this is repeated. It starts to look like the workings of a plan, of what they don't know yet, but something is off. So in January of 2020, they finally catch up to him at the site. And when they do, he has a hand-drawn sketch of the jail on it. And according to the arresting officers, he tried to chew it up and swallow it. At that point, investigators go back and start looking at everything a bit differently. They pull surveillance, they track movement, they start asking a new question. What exactly was he doing inside that building all those times? And then they start to open things up. They see where he was going, they take a look in there. They start opening up walls, checking hidden spaces. And what they find is he wasn't just studying the jail. He was changing it. He was leaving things behind. Hidden inside the structure were guns, ammunition, tools, escape equipment built into the walls of the jail, a jail that hadn't opened yet. You got to think about it. A detention center exists to contain danger and dangerous people. And before this one even had the chance to have a single inmate, the danger was already built inside of it, hidden beneath cinder blocks and grout, covered up with painter's tape on windows so the security cameras outside couldn't see. That's where the story sticks, not just because it's bizarre and weird, because it breaks the categories that people rely on. We like our reformers to look like reformers. We like our threats to be obvious. We like to believe that we can tell the difference between the two by just looking. This story doesn't let you do that. Instead, it leaves you with this, a brand new jail in Nashville, still unfinished, still echoing with dust in the air and the workers coming in and out. And inside the walls where no one was looking, guns and bullets sitting in the dark, put there by someone the public trusted to understand the system. And before that jail ever held a single inmate, it was already compromised from the inside. And both his motivations in doing it are they're not a mystery in so much as he said he wanted prison change and putting guns inside of a prison will certainly make some changes. His intentions or what he had hoped to accomplish long term by this brazen criminal stunt that's incredible. I mean, arming prisoners inside of a unbuilt prison is a real dangerous move. So what he was actually trying to accomplish remains unseen, but it shows an interesting thing about when you truly believe a system is broken or you're morally obligated to change something, you can oftentimes blind yourself to, you know, the absolute ridiculousness of what you're choosing to do in order to make that happen. And that can be true of prison reform, politics, personal life. If you feel so emotionally strong about something, it can blind your judgment. And I think that, that dovetails well with what we're talking about in the skewing of the narrative around this ceasefire negotiation, in that because people believe so passionately that, you Trump is so evil and so wrong, that they do get blinded to their own, you know, they truly do believe it. So it makes a lot of the things they do justifiable to themselves because the greater, it's the road to hell is paved with good intentions and the effort to make it stick. And you can justify away a lot of the actions or your inability to really, you can do, you can logically make, you can separate yourself from the actions and justify them for the greater good, even if logically you realize that maybe I'm going a bit too far here. But in the whole, Trump's so evil that it's worth making him look bad and being a bit intellectually dishonest than it is, because he is that bad. And once you do that, you start losing the complete ability to have intellectually honest conversations, both with others and with yourself. And when you stop having them with yourself, it's impossible to have them with others because you're working off of a flawed operating system of your own making. And so I always encourage people to always try and take a step back and wonder if you're being, if you're hearing a story, interpreting it, or if you're being fed one. If you're reacting because you want it to be true, or are you reacting because it is? Are you, would you believe it if it came from someone you hated? Or do you only believe it because it confirms what you want to believe? And all of those things, if you can do them on an individual basis, will always help you to be able to, you know, critically look through the information being presented to you. Because now, in this modern world, you're not being presented information at a newsstand to where you get to pick which one you read. You take a look, oh, that story's interesting. That you are a customer at a tasting menu of stories that is well researched with algorithmic engines behind them to serve you exactly what it is that you want. And if you don't recognize it for what it is, if you don't recognize that you are being fed what you would like to believe, then it is really easy to not be self-critical or to look at things through a lens of being self-critical or trying to poke holes in your own thought process. Because, don't just try to search for things that you already believe. Try to poke holes in what you believe. If it still holds water, it's worth holding on to. But if you just ignore the things that might poke holes in what you believe, then you are an active participant in your own ignorance. And it is certainly exacerbated by modern technology and the speed of media narratives and the speed of technology and devices and the interconnectivity of the world. But if you are in the driver's seat or passenger seat of the car driving towards your own ignorance, helping with directions throughout the journey, then you have to recognize your own complicity. Or you can make efforts to be self-critical and look at the world objectively and not just try to pat yourself on the back for being right all the time, because there's a difference between being right because you called something was going to happen and getting to take that told you so victory lap, and being right because it's what actually happened. Because if you take the victory lap because you decided to rephrase or reframe or move the goalposts of what you consider a victory just so that you get to feel good, it's not actual progress. It's self-congratulatory reframing of how all of this works. And where we come to in all of this is, I hope that, so on Monday, I had talked about the shifting of the war. That at this point, it becomes we bombed what we needed to bomb for the most part. Most of the military objectives, as they had stated, were handled. We have decimated the leadership, sank the Navy, galvanized the Gulf allies, begrudgingly, the Europeans have a framework of their potential involvement in protection of their own best interests. But it moved to the economic side of things and what the future might look like. That was Monday. Tuesday was the deadline day for Infrastructure Day. We talked about that. And today we are in a new phase of it. This is the negotiation phase. And recognize the new phases of what they are for what they are, but also be clear about what they are not. They are not a finalized treaty. They are not an agreement. Iran is not to be trusted, but they can be worked with. And any pause to where you can take a step back from the brink is a benefit. And I think that that's worth recognizing, being hopeful about what it could mean, not, being starry eyed about it being perfect or ta-da, we won or it's over. Go and look at it with a clear and level head about what it is and what it isn't, and recognize that it is a new stage. And that while when we sit down across the table from one another, we might disagree. There might be some sticking points that are contentious. There are certainly, I know from the United States side, there are certain hard hard passes, things that we are not going to negotiate on, many of which were on that 10-point plan that Iran put out about having a nuclear uh, enrichment and keeping their stuff and charging $2 million per boat and them keeping control of the strait. A lot of those things that are on that list are just non-starters. But so don't assume that their list of, their Christmas list of demands that Iran put out and is touting as this is what we put out there and this is what they've agreed to. Recognize that's not even close to the case. And know that those lists, both ours and theirs, will change as this goes on. And don't claim victory, don't espouse defeat before anything's happened. And Clayton did just text me a moment ago. He's on his way back to the station. So since he had the inability to put ads on or do this transfer, and I've just had to drag this out until we got this sorted. Because normally during these commercials, I take some time to kind of gather my thoughts and reframe some stuff.
Hey
So this
Jeb,
part is a bit.
I'm back.
We
Yep,
have Clayton back.
yep.
Well,
Uh,
we have him here. Did we find Jack?
we have not yet.
Um,
But the
regale the people with the story of the missing Jack. Did Delk find out that he was missing this morning before he came to the station,
it,
or?
it was right before he came into the show. So, yeah, I don't know, man. We'll find out. We'll see. The search will continue.
Well, if anybody sees Jack, I gave the number
Thank
and
you.
the
No, that's great.
location at the start. So if anybody does see him, and like I said, I know the show is a bit unique today, so I appreciate y'all bearing with me. But like I said, I'm glad that it provided the opportunity to kind of go through a lot of these changes in more detail than a lot of times commercial breaks would have allowed for. So I think it was beneficial. And yeah, so thank y'all so very much for being with me today on this slightly different version of In the Middle of It. Uh, Still got the same amount of Jeb with way less commercial breaks because the version of me talking is probably about the same length of time. So I think we're all sorted here. So Clayton, thank you for getting back here to put a pin on the end of this here.
And
Uh,
thank you for adjusting and being flexible with us today. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. And hope if anybody sees Jack, again, the number 931 797 5740. That's Glendale on John Finney Road is where Jack has vanished from. I'm sure he's out frolicking, getting into some tomfoolery and hollering at the ladies. But if you do see him, I know Del certainly want him back to hear of his adventures. So until I see y'all tomorrow, everybody be careful, be kind, be good, and I will see you